According to Pew Research, 35% of people 18 to 29 say social media is the most helpful source of information on the 2016 presidential election. But before the internet, there was newspapers and later television and radio. To see how media has transitioned over the years and its role in politics, we turn to presidential historian Mike Purdy. Welcome back, Mike.
Thank you.
So what was the media's role dating back to the very beginning of elections?
Well, I think it has been different. So early on, of course, candidates didn't even campaign. It was deemed undignified to campaign, so there wasn't much that could be really covered. And the newspapers that you had then were really instruments of political parties. So they would be the ones to spout the party line. Jefferson had a newspaper that was loyal to him. Every candidate had newspapers that were loyal to them. And so you can also take a look, it's very interesting, I think, when Abraham Lincoln was president, he gave his Gettysburg Address, and because the newspapers were political in nature, one party or one paper after the Gettysburg Address said that it was silly, flat, and dishwatery utterances. That's what they had to say about the Gettysburg Address. So politics has always been there and has been part of our national discourse.
Strong words there. When do you think the power of the media in elections was first realized?
Well, I think it started to grow in the early 1900s. That's when you really had the rise of more independent journalism. I think at the same time that you have transportation changes that are coming that make it easier for reporters to cover things so that there are things to cover. Of course, early on when candidates didn't campaign or they only campaigned from their front porch, not much really to cover. So the 1900s were really the rise of much more media. Theodore Roosevelt made space for reporters in the White House. And so there was a recognition that the media had an increased role around those times.
Are there any newspapers or journalists that stand out to you?
Newspapers or journalists that stand out? Well, I think there have been some mainstay newspapers. The New York Times has obviously been a main one and is looked to. It's part of what we would call the mainstream media. And of course, that's criticized by many people as having a bias. Some people will say the mainstream media has a liberal bias. Of course, really all media has some form of bias because these are people who are doing the reporting.
I mean, yeah, we're human. We certainly, I'm sure, have our own opinions, but it's important for us to try to set that aside and be a journalist and just deliver the facts and not insert our opinion. One name, speaking of journalists, that comes up, what do you think about Thomas Paine? Would you consider him a journalist?
Thomas Paine, I'm not sure that it immediately strikes me that he was a journalist. He certainly had a key role in communications through his writing during the revolutionary times. And I think we've seen over time the role of journalism, the role of media becoming much more defined, much more pronounced, whereas early on maybe it was just communications. And you would write a book, you'd write Common Sense, and you would get that published and you would get that out. Now we've got the focus. We've got not just newspaper journalism, we have television, we have radio, and of course we've got the rise of social media now.
And let's talk about that. In the last few days, we've been flooded with WikiLeaks emails, those undercover videos that are damaging to the Democratic Party, the Access Hollywood tape. With the 2016 presidential election less than 2 weeks away, social media, could not be more powerful, but also very dangerous. How is social media shaping this particular election?
Well, I think it's shaping it in very significant ways, much more so than any previous election. In 2008, Barack Obama did make use of social media, but I think we're seeing it up to a different level now, partially because of technology, partially because Donald Trump is a master of social media. He's a master of Twitter. views it as his own newspaper. But one of the challenges I think that we face with social media is that it ends up becoming a place where people can say whatever they want, even though it might not be true. And so, in some ways, I wonder if social media is pushing us toward living in a post fact or a post truth era where because people can say whatever they want, there's no independent journalism, no independent vetting of the facts and what's going on.
That's a great point. Social media sites like Facebook allow anyone to create and distribute content to their friends and family, and that leaves a lot of nonsense to circulate widely. I've seen a lot of inaccurate memes, things taken out of context. Certainly, it's a little disturbing in a lot of ways because you can see how many times they've been shared and people comment as if it's the truth. And for me, as somebody who watched every single one of the debates, I look at these memes and I know that they're not true. But sometimes you just can't argue with people. You just kind of have to let it be. There's nothing you can do about it. But it is disturbing to see all these memes, all these different facts coming out that just aren't true.
I think so. And I think people end up, creating their own facts, which aren't true, as you say, oftentimes. And what social media points toward in some ways, I think, is that we are just living in a very, very polarized society, a very divided nation. And I tend to think that social media, where we've got this individualization of how we communicate. So it's not just we have a central news source, whether that's radio or television or newspaper, but now everybody is their own news source, whether it's true or not.
And speaking of your own news source, we see Hillary Clinton with Media Matters. We see Donald Trump. There's talk that he might start his own media company. Is that do you see that trend? Are we going toward that? Are we all going to kind of have our own media companies?
Well, I think there's definitely has been this trend recently where there's been a movement away from the mainstream media and the creation of media companies that tailor their message to a particular audience. So we might look at Fox News or Breitbart, or on the liberal side, MSNBC, focuses to particular constituencies. If Donald Trump does decide, if he loses the presidency and he does decide to start Trump Media or Trump TV, then certainly that's going to be a very focused conservative message similar to what he has been expounding on the campaign trail.
Americans' trust and confidence hit its highest point back in 1976. That was at 72% in the wake of Watergate. After staying in the low to mid-50s through the late 1990s and into the early years of the new century, Americans' trust in the media has fallen slowly and steadily. It has consistently been below a majority level since 2007. These days, Americans' trust and confidence in the mass media to report the news fully and accurately and fairly has dropped to its lowest level in Gallup polling history. Just 32% saying they have a great deal or fair amount of trust in the media. Do you think that this shift in all these different types of mediums there is a result of this?
I think so. I think the lack of trust probably comes partially from the fact that some people look at what the mainstream media or the media is saying and they say, I don't agree with that, so therefore I don't trust it. And again, this is one of the things that comes about when we have so much media out there, where we've got technology that enables us to have instant access to news, to create our own news, as it were. And so certainly that's one of the reasons why I think we're seeing the trust and confidence in the media go down.
And has this distrust impacted the actual election differently than in previous elections?
That's a great question. I think it probably has, in the sense that we have simply become much more polarized. You could look at this election and compare it to previous elections, And I think in some senses there's no comparison. We've talked before about how this election is very unprecedented in many ways. And one of the ways is in the deep, deep divisions that we're seeing in the country.
Certainly an election like we've never seen before. Presidential historian Mike Purdy, always great to have you on with us.
Thank you.